Please introduce yourself.
Okay. Hello everyone, I'm Takeshi Suzuki. I'm from Meiji University, Tokyo, and Steve Llano from St. John's University, New York will talk about the rest of my presentation, our presentation. And 5 years ago, we had a discussion for 3 days in New York in his apartment about what kind of future possible research topic for debate scholars. And we came up with interesting concept, Republicacy. Everybody talking about privacy in the 20th century, and if you use Google search, you will hit millions of materials about privacy, but no one is talking about Republicacy. So we named it as New Compass in the Age of Trans Science, and you are the first audience to hear our presentation on Republicacy. And okay, this is the outline of our presentation. First, I will talk about introduction and historical backdrop of the problem and practical necessities for Republicacy in contemporary society. And for the section 4 and 5, Steve will talk about putting the public into Republicacy and conclusion and the pedagogical implications. Okay, let's start with introduction, and let me define the Republicacy. Whereas privacy means a state of individuals being free from public attention, we argue that Republicacy is meant to be the state of individual to being able to get involved with public affairs. We believe that each individual should be entitled to be a member of contemporary society who has rights and responsibility for public engagement. The very concept of Republicacy questions our identity when it comes to the issue of democratic political engagement in 3 ways. The first, as a taxpayer, are we competent enough to judge how our taxed money is used effectively? If we think so, with what criteria should we evaluate how our taxed money is used effectively? Next, as an eligible voter, are we competent enough to evaluate how candidates are performing in campaigns? If we think so, with what basis should we evaluate how likely we are to achieve our policy expectations? Finally, as a world citizen, are we competent enough to judge our government policy goals, especially if they can meet sustainable development goals? If we think so, with what standards should we employ the long-term global goals? In the age of unexpected and unprecedented threats such as climate change, terrorism, and COVID-19 pandemic, merely being malcontender or wishy-washy, cynical people make ourselves at the mercy of the people, the power that be. And already in half century ago, Alvin Weinberg argues that he called the question which can be asked of science and yet which cannot be answered by science as trans science. Now we argue that we are living in the age of trans science. For these questions, since they are epistemologically speaking, questions of fact can be stated in the language of science, they are not unanswerable by science. We should not only ask them to debate and discuss in the public sphere, but also make ourselves listen and hopefully participate in such public debate and discussion. For example, more recently in April of 2017, scientists around the world organized for a March for Science with the express purpose of calling attention to the importance of having scientific evidence and inform public policy. Then, President Donald Trump has proposed cutting funding to climate change research in the EPA and publicly questioned the reality of climate change. In respect, scientists organized political demonstrations around the world to call attention to the importance of science. Around 150,000 people showed up for the march in Washington, D.C. on April 22nd, with other events occurring in cities around the world. In a similar way, democracy is sort of to have to meet the same burden. Publics are told in countless ways to educate themselves, to be informed on issues, and to make sure to vote in all opportunity to do so. At the same time, they are asked to make judgment on issues that defy their perceived capacity for judgment. Now let me go to the historical backdrop of the problem. There are two justifications for arguing Republicacy. The first justification came from the area of political philosophy. David Miller defines political philosophy as an investigation into the nature, causes, and effect of good and bad government. Miller proposed reasons why making such good and bad government distinctions are essential. The first, that good and bad government profoundly affects the quality of human lives. It really makes a difference to our lives whether we are governed well or badly. The second idea proposed by Miller is that form our government takes is not predetermined. We have a choice to make. Under the system of representative democracy, we are merely forced to choose hopefuls to be elected so that they may achieve what they expect them to achieve. We have little means to check how responsible they are against their promises once they are elected until the next election comes. Third and final idea proposed by Miller is that we can know what distinguishes good government from bad. We can trace the effect of different forms of government. In other words, there are such things as political knowledge. I am glad first presentation talks about yes and no answer. And our answer to Miller's claim is yes and no. Our answer is yes, in that we can trace the effect of different forms of government if it is fully examined, explained by politicians and media, and at the same time ascertained by their electorate. But our answer is no, in that some effect of different policies are taken by the government, since the complexity of contemporary society makes it extremely difficult to explain the effect of public policies, especially when they are involved with international issues on long-term basis. Therefore, it is essential for global leaders and citizens to engage these questions productively. We believe that Republicacy is a missing set of practices here. And second justification for Republicacy is psychological one. We can assume that human beings have both chances to be good and risk to be evil. Each of you can be good person or evil person. The second psychological justification for acquiring Republicacy is that human beings are more likely to be evil in the time of stress than in times of comfort. I have to skip the psychologist explanation for this, but we know our experience that we tend to make stupid decisions in the times of stress. The final final psychological justification for Republicacy is that in a highly sophisticated society, we tend to form specialized groups where evil may easily be rather than fragmented into different sections. If you remember the Vietnam War, best and brightest made a stupid decision, worst decision, but when they are fragmented as one soldier, one scientist, one economic advisor, they are not responsible for the entire stupid, crazy, evil decision. Okay, my final part, the practical necessities for Republicacy in contemporary society. I think there are three pressing needs to develop such a concept if we want to make ourselves get involved with democratic practices as member of publicly open society. Initially, our democratic society is threatened by what we call chaotic leadership. Chaotic leaders first intentionally create social chaos in order to place themselves as possible leader who can address it. Chaotic leaders prefer confusion over order, division over unity, and hatred over mutual help. by creating number of social destabilization and unpredictability, chaotic leader try to appear, I am the only one by whom people should depend. In the past, leaders were supposed to provide a course of action for a better future. But birth of Trump administration is perfect example of chaotic leadership. And still 40% of American people are admiring chaotic leader Trump. The second and related practical need for Republicacy is that how we can maximize the opportunity to achieve the good is increasingly uncertain at best and hopeless at worst. And final practical and pressing need for Republicacy is that we are faced with the fragile nature of contemporary risk society. Some predict that artificial intelligence can and will deprive human beings of their job and power to make decisions. What is needed is exactly the opposite. Namely, we need to foster our intellectual ability for assessment, innovation, and critical decision making. And that's all my part, and still will continue.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the role of publics in Republicacy and the pedagogical implications of everything that Professor Suzuki and I have come up with. So we rely a lot on the work of Robert Asen and his work on publics. It's a multi-year sort of project that Professor Asen is involved in, and I put this quote up. I won't read it to you, but I think it sort of sums up the idea of what publics are in Republicacy. We believe strongly that in a lot of the ways that we think about argumentation and the ways that we think about debating, in all of these very cheerful things that Dr. Suzuki has brought up to us about chaotic leadership, the inability to find the good in the political, and it's so necessary, and our multiple roles of trying to judge what a good thing is in government, it seems almost impossible. But maybe we could take the focus off of policy and infuse it with a theory of public, the way Asen talks about it. Two key things with the way Asen discusses it is publics are always sort of alive. They're forming and they're disbanding. So they're happening kind of all the time, and they're happening in networks of relationships. So the public is not this sort of, enlightenment idea. That's not sort of what we're shipping. This firm kind of extant thing that you would see out of maybe Frankfurt school thinking, but more of this living kind of thing that has to be stirred like a roux or like very good scrambled eggs. It has to be kept kind of working in order to be good. So aiming at publics and thinking about the role of publics in terms of good policy and how that happens is a good solution to some of these things, with the idea of this as being a necessary component of that when you have leaders who are not there to make good policy. And a populace that is so fragmented is difficult for them to see socially good policy. So this leads us to pedagogical implications. So I'll bring up some words of William Keith from the Wake Forest Developmental Debate Conference, just as an example. Now these were suggestions made in 2010 about what American debate, competitive debate, should do to become more relevant. These have been ignored in 2010. They still don't do any of this, and they never will. But for us in Republicacy, we think these are the principles of what good pedagogy should be doing in terms of when we teach argumentation and we teach debate to students. These are the principles. Debate is critical deliberation, accountability and transparency to publics, and we would use the Asen understanding of that, and stakeholders kind of bound together as sort of the rubric or the litmus test of whether the argument is good. So what we're trying to push is, and accessibility. It has to be accessible to a number of different audiences, a number of different kinds of people. We can't just leave people out because they aren't smart enough, or their politics are not the right ones, or they watch Fox News or whatever. It's too important for all of that, right? This kind of thing. One of the ways we can think about this is Perlman and Ulrich-Stidicke's idea of the universal audience, and I want to focus on this quote about the universal audience, which is often ignored, which I think they're talking about Asen's conception of publics when they say the universal audience can be studied for great profit through different times to see what is universally valid, what is reasonable, what is real and true and objectively valid, is a temporal study. They say every universal audience across time and culture is different, which I think kind of confuses people about what this universal audience theory is about. But what it really is about is this idea that they understand these things are formed. They're not pre-existence. Rationality and reasonability for Perlman and Ulrich-Stidicke is formed in the moment, and it changes over time. And I think this is an important way to think about the rubric for when we're teaching argument. The rubric for when we're teaching debate should be like, how did you constitute that moment of that public in that place where you want to reach them in order to show that public you are sustained, nurtured, that's an Eason word, public should be nurtured through discourse and should be formed. So did you get that public nurtured, sustained, and coalesced enough to understand that it can make moves in public policy? So it's reaching and sustaining and crafting these publics is what Republicacy is about, rather than kind of the old order, which is let's make a rational appeal with good solid evidence to a decision maker who has a mandate from an electorate and actually wants to make policy. It's too many moving parts. Many of these moving parts are not relevant anymore. When you have all the, we can just list the American chaotic leaders. There's just tons of them. Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Matt Gaetz, Donald Trump. There's just endless. And I think every society you can think of someone in your parliament or in your representative body who is a chaotic leader. These people aren't going to. Is that training for young people a useful kind of training for what they need to be doing in order to engage the good in the society and the public? So this is kind of what we suggest pedagogically is what Republicacy tries to look like in the classroom. So we move from, did you address all the objections successfully? Is there anything left on the table? We kind of teach that. We say, okay, is there anything that they could say against you? Okay, well then you have a good argument because no one can oppose. Remember, in the world that we're describing, people might not be interested in opposing for it. They may be like, well, how can I make this a controversy to put myself on TV more? Might be what an elected leader would do. Did the arguer establish the best rational evidence for their position? Maybe we move a little bit away from that and towards, did the arguer constitute a recognizable public for their arguments? Did you see a place where you could fit in with that, where you could stand, where you could be a part of it? Did the arguer establish reasons for their publics to be convinced, which is more the universal audience kind of question, is how did you constitute that group? Did you constitute that group in a way to show them that they exist in this particular way, and that they can address these things? So that is our idea that we've been talking about for many years, and we look forward to seeing what you all have to say about it. So thank you for listening.
We have hopefully time for questions.
Can I go back to the slide where you talked about the 3 things we need for the yes? As for the second category, you said transparency. What did you mean by transparency here?
So I can tell you what I think it means for Republicacy, but I'll tell you what William Keith I think means is that there's no value in something being technically inaccessible or something that requires some expertise to understand. There's very little value in that in terms of the value of debate. So some people tend to think that debating is very valuable because it takes a long time to master the technical intricacies of making a very good argument. And he's saying that we need to kind of move away from that in order for this to be relevant. But he's also, it's actually quite a good piece to read because he's tracing it with the history of the university as well. He's saying universities are moving towards this and debate is still stuck in the 50s. For Republicacy, I think what this means is transparency of the idea that everyone can participate in this. There's no mystery here. There aren't certain people who are allowed to speak for various reasons, maybe less of an expertise and more of a credibility issue as a reason to be able to speak. That's what I think it means, is transparency is, this is accessible to everyone. I'm not the secret really good orator or really good debater that only I get to speak. Some people do have kind of a gift for that, but I think the idea is that everyone could kind of contribute in terms of the nurturing and sustaining and creating the publics. So, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, when we came up with the idea of Republicacy, we tried to save democracy with democratic accomplishment and democratic practice, because now democracy is dying and the people have very little fear about it, and that is real fear we have to fear. I think Leah has also a question.
Yes. Do you think that the chaos leaders, Boebert and Greene and Trump, etc., that they don't think they're addressing a universal audience? I mean, don't they?
Oh, that's a good question.
Don't they
Mhm.
believe that they're
Yeah.
stating the common sense?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think they do. I think that's the funny thing about universal audiences. It says more about, so Perlman and Ulbricht say it's a matter of fact, not right, I think is the phrase they use, and people are like, what does this mean? I think my interpretation of that is that you can say, this is what they think is unquestionable, common sense, universally valid, and then you can judge the speaker on that. Kind of maybe in that American rhetorical tradition of the Ed Black example of the cancer of communism. So you could say, in Black's terminology, you say, well, this would extend on a plane to mean we should just nuke ourselves, because if there's communists here, then we should just destroy the entire body before euthanize the country. But I think in the Perlman-Ulbricht sense, it's this idea of like, be aware that we're always sort of doing that we're always making these kind of assumptions about things like that. I think they're addressing universal, but the undefined universal audience would be the one to come in and say, well, I recognize that as this subgroup. But I mean, I think it's an interesting question because it gets into the counterpublic stuff, which we're still sort of working out, which is what is the role of counterpublics in Republicacy? And it feels like there's really important stuff to say there as well as but I think Asen's stuff deals with that pretty well too. But I mean, it's a good question. I think everybody has, even in this presentation, we're doing universal audience stuff, but we can be judged on that to say, oh, you think that's universally valid, there might be a problem with that. So maybe that would be some kind of a new rhetoric idea of fallacy. Is like if you make an argument that the undefined universal audience would not like, you've committed a fallacy. Maybe that's like the universal audience fallacy. I don't know. This is the way I think about it.
How would we characterize two people arguing about the legitimacy of the other one's universal audience? Suppose we wanted to tell Marjorie Taylor Greene that you're stupid to imagine that this group that you have in mind should be the arbiter of what we do. Is there a place you can stand to say my universal audience is better than yours?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. That's the hard part about, it's like, what is it, pages 30 to 33 is the universal audience section of New Rhetoric, and the book is 600 pages.
Okay.
They kind of leave us hanging. That's a great, I've thought about that a little bit, is how do you make the undefined universal audience an operable thing? I think this is a very difficult question.
Well,
I
it
think
sounds like you can't criticize someone else's unless you can concretize it somehow.
you're right. Yeah. I think this is a good question. I think so for chaotic leaders, I think maybe they might not be interested in such a thing unless it gives them more fuel to the fire. So I don't know, my sense of it, I don't know what you would think about this answer, but my sense of it is that we try to move away from addressing the policymakers, and we address publics and constitute the publics as sort of a larger kind of force to kind of make things occur and kind of push in ways that, because we are kind of fragmented by these people, and we're fragmented by the media. And how do you weigh in on this latest controversy? And that's what everyone kind of talks about. I have family members who are Fox News addicts, and they want to talk about this minuscule stuff, fight about. But then I also have family members who are addicted to MSNBC, and they want to fight about this time. They all want to talk about Hunter Biden. Like, who cares about Hunter Biden, right? We have all these gargantuan problems in the world that we face globally as people. And that was kind of our inspiration for this, is how do we get people? But I think it's a good point, is like, if I want to, it's a good pedagogical question, because we teach our students, for like, if you have the good evidence from the experts and you have a good rational argument, then that's the policy that should be done. And then like, well, how come it hasn't been done yet? How come it won't be done? How come? And so this is kind of a gap. So maybe it's like, well, we need to constitute kind of organizing larger groups of people that say we have the power to maybe do something different. That's kind of the way I think about it. I don't know what you would add to that.
Yeah, also we argue that the Republicacy should be offered as not only either right or responsibility. We argue that both rights and responsibility for the individuals in contemporary society. That's why we are planning to develop this project into larger scale, starting from scratch. That debate education is only a beginning, and also debate education has to be rehabilitated. How we can promote Republicacy concept for each individual. Mm-hmm. Also, the media should play greater role. Just following the powerful people or just criticizing powerful people is not enough. They need a balanced neutrality presenting both side opinion of plus and minus of each policy and political people, so that each people will think and compare the plus and minus side of each public policies. But now they are running for the economic profit and
Yeah.
more publication rather than educating the society. That's why we advocate Republicacy as a kind of program to start rehabilitating democracy and educating people.
Thank you. We need to leave time for people to move rooms.
Thank you.
Yeah, good job. Good job. Good job.